More than 30 people killed, nearly $200 billion in damage. Kansans sent help and prayers to the victims of Hurricane Harvey. Meanwhile, Kansas emergency officials have been keeping a close eye and are learning from the experiences in Texas. We'll take a look at Kansas disaster preparedness in the wake of the Houston devastation. Also, the member of a prominent political family. He was the son and grandson of Kansas governors. He himself served as lieutenant governor. This week, Kansas said goodbye to Tom Docking, who lost his battle with cancer. We'll take a look back at his place in Kansas history and his family's political legacy in the Sunflower State. Plus, the race to become the next Kansas governor seems to get more crowded by the day. We have expert analysis on the status of what some say will be a watershed election next year. And the high school football season is now officially underway. Amidst all the excitement, growing concerns over head injuries. Is enough being done to protect your kids on the field? We'll take an in-depth look at all these stories. Kansas Week starts right now. I'm Pilar Pedraza. Thanks for joining us. We begin with a story that has dominated headlines all week and why a hurricane hundreds of miles away still hits close to home. The heartbreak and devastation continues to mount after Hurricane Harvey dumped 52 inches of rain on Houston over the last several days. Combined with devastating winds, the storm has destroyed more than 30,000 homes. The death toll has now exceeded 30 people and continues to grow. This storm stretched the limits of state and local response. Most of the rescues occurred at the hands of volunteers with boats, large trucks, and front-end loaders. President Trump visited the disaster zone on Tuesday, pledging maximum help from the federal government. Governor Greg Abbott says Texas will need much more than $125 billion from the feds to recover from this devastation. It's America's worst natural disaster in 10 years and has officials across the country evaluating the preparation and response. Because whether hurricanes, earthquakes, or tornadoes, natural disasters happen everywhere, and there will be a next time. We have our share of destructive storms in Kansas as well. So disaster response is something local, state, and county authorities, federal authorities as well, always training for. We're glad to have Butler County's Assistant Emergency Manager, Carrie Cordles. I knew I was going to mess that up. Cordles with us, as well as Craig Andrus, a news anchor with KSNW TV, and Senator Oletha Faust-Goudeau, a Democrat from Wichita in the state legislature, to discuss some of these issues. Carrie, let's start with you. What has stood out to you as you've watched the coverage of what's going on in Texas as something that could be of use to emergency management here in Kansas?
Well, one thing I want to touch on first is that we need to be careful we don't take the attitude that, well, that's a hurricane, that's hurricane country, we're not hurricane country, so we don't ever have to worry about what's going on down there. But what we're seeing down there is a disaster that is beyond the scope of anything that they've ever experienced before. And so we need to stop and look at, we may not be in hurricane country, we may not have hurricanes, but what disasters could strike us that would be beyond the scope of anything that we've ever seen before? Because our run-of-the-mill disasters could suddenly become that once-in-a-lifetime disaster, and we need to make sure that our game is not just to this point, but to this point, and that we're prepared for that.
And certainly, Craig, you and I both have covered numerous disasters just in the last couple of years that really have kind of pushed the capabilities here in Kansas.
Absolutely. You know, we talk about the Anderson Creek wildfire, the wildfires that we've had. We are finding out new things, and I'm sure you have many of these protocols that have been enacted since, things that we didn't know that we needed to know, that we do now, because disaster preparedness takes time, it takes effort, and it takes a lot of money. And the disasters that we've seen in Kansas aren't necessarily to the scope and scale that we've seen certainly in Texas with what's going on right now, but we are not that far off from one of those potentially happening here. We have a lot of things that can happen in Kansas, and keep in mind that if we do get a major earthquake nearby, that could trigger something that we haven't seen before either. So preparedness is a big, big deal, and I've talked to so many people this week about what's happening in Texas right now and what we need to try and do to learn from this. Everybody from the Salvation Army to the American Red Cross to even Catholic charities, Mennonite Disaster Service, they're all looking at long-term ways to say, how can we get better at doing what we're doing? How can we prepare for something like this? Because a lot of the rescues that we've seen come from people that have just volunteered to step up. And we do have, you know, our folks that help out.
Yeah.
And,
Right.
and I
Yeah.
will say this, Butler County, Sedgwick County, even up into Marion County down south of here with the Wild Creek fires out in Hutchinson, we've got a good disaster preparedness team built together within the state.
Yep.
But, when it comes to something major, there's always something new to learn.
Well, and you touched on an important thing too, is that you don't want to look at the disaster as an entirety and say, well, that's a hurricane, but instead look at the disaster and its components and say, okay, they're doing sheltering, we could potentially have to do sheltering. They're doing volunteer management and donations management. Those are components that we're going to have to tackle as well. So if we look at the components, rather than just saying it's a hurricane disaster, then we can focus on where do we need to get better in managing the influx of spontaneous volunteers, managing the influx of donations, managing mass care and sheltering, and those kind of things.
And talking about donations, obviously a lot of the money for responding to disasters like this comes from private donations, but the majority really, Aletha, is from the state and federal government.
Well, and absolutely. First off, a lot of us here, even on the panel, we know people personally in Texas. So it's not a them and an us. We're all in this together. And certainly, I believe we can learn from what they are doing. But I was glad to hear that Governor Brownback is sending our National Guard there. I did speak to General Lee Taffanelli, he's really big on this, having served in the military, and I'm just excited to see everybody pulling together to go and help.
Yeah. But the dollar figures we're talking about, just in response, not in rebuilding, just in response, huge. I mean, when we mobilize the National Guard and send them down to Texas to help out, that's dollars coming out of Kansas's pocket. I know a year or so ago when we were dealing with flooding in Butler County, and they were struggling with trying to get money from the federal government because of changes in FEMA rules, and we're hearing more changes in FEMA rules now coming through. The funding is certainly an issue that is going to impact state legislatures across the country over the next couple of years. I mean, yeah, Harvey is probably the worst we've seen in the last 10 years, but we see natural disasters, mega disasters in every state every year.
Absolutely. And like in 2006, when we had the ice storm here, we're still paying a little bit for that even today. And so absolutely, we're going to have to find money from somewhere to help out.
Senator, I will say this too. I know that the Adjutant General's budget is only so big. You mentioned Lee Taffanelli, and that budget is only so large. It's interesting to see the donations and the need for donations. When I interviewed and talked to all the people down in Texas and what their needs are, and then I asked locally, what are our needs here? Because we are sending people down. And like the American Red Cross yesterday talked to me extensively about the fact that we have to have people here in case we have something that would happen here. The Red Cross still responds to disasters. They still go to house fires. They've got to have staff here. But when I asked about donations, I'll give you an example. Catholic Charities, I talked to them, and I talked to the executive director here in Wichita, and I said, since the Catholic Charities website went live earlier this week to take donations, I said, how are the donations coming along? And she said, well, it's about $1,000 a minute that are coming in.
Wow.
And that was exactly my reaction. I said, wow, that's incredible. And then I asked her for a follow-up. I said, and how is that in meeting expectations? And she paused for not even a split second and said, Craig, I don't think anybody knows what the expectations are. I don't think anybody realizes how much this is going to cost, because 3 years from now, 5 years from now, they may still have volunteers, caseworkers down there. So the local response, I know, can be a challenge to get people together long term.
Well, and as we're talking about that local response in the long term, we here in Kansas have dealt with some major issues over the last few years. What have we learned about dealing with things like Greensburg 10 years ago? I think 10 years ago, had to do the math for a second. From Greensburg, from the wildfires last year and earlier this year up in Reno County as well. What have we learned there that we can apply to what's going on in Texas?
Some of the big things that we've picked up, like from the wildfires, for example, is how do we go about requesting help? What is the process we follow? Who do we call in order to efficiently request resources? Because if Group A is asking for something, Group B is asking for something, and Group C is asking for something, and we don't realize that we're all asking for the same thing from the same pot, then we get an inefficient use of resources. So how to manage that, getting the stuff to the people who need it when they need it is very important. Another thing that we've really been hitting hard as well is we know when we have a big event, we're going to have an influx of people who want to help. They're going to show up, big hearts, ready to roll. But they need to be given a job. There has to be a way to match them with a task and put them to work. And so we've been working a lot with the United Way, figuring out how to do the volunteer reception centers and volunteer management and things like that, so it actually becomes an efficient, productive process to put them to work.
I would say definitely that communication across agencies and the coordination is probably the biggest change I've seen in disaster response, covering it in the 2+ decades of my career. So I would agree with you on that. Very important. Thank you so much, Carrie, for joining us. I appreciate you taking time out of your schedule to come kind of enlighten us on what is going on.
Glad to be here.
All right. And we also want to move on. We've got lots of other topics to look at, including our second big story of the week. Many in Kansas are mourning the passing of Thomas Docking. The 63-year-old former lieutenant governor was born into a political legacy, carving his own niche in the most powerful Democratic family in Kansas history. But Docking leaves his biggest mark as a leader in downtown Wichita's revitalization. Thomas Docking was just 29 years old in 1983 when he took office as lieutenant governor under Governor John Carlin. 33 years old when he narrowly lost his own bid for governor on the top of the ticket in 1986. The son and grandson of Kansas governors, Docking remained active in Democratic politics, with his wife Jill losing a bid for lieutenant governor in 2014. But arguably, his biggest contributions to his city and his state came outside of the political arena. Docking had a vision for a bustling downtown Wichita and was a driving force behind the development of Old Town. He was also a major fundraiser for the University of Kansas, pairing with his wife to raise more than $1.5 million for the university. Docking lost his fight against cancer this week, passing at the age of 63. And joining our panel now to help discuss some of these political issues as well as the Docking legacy, Wichita State University political science professor Dr. Mel Kahn. Thank you so much for being here. All right, so I want to start with you. Thomas Docking, a long legacy here in Kansas. How much was his actions, how much being born into the Docking family, which really is a major political powerhouse here?
Yes, and he became lieutenant governor still in his 20s. And I think one important aspect, in addition to his political achievements, as well as civic activity, he was a decent human being. He was what Germans call a Mensch, a human being of the highest order. And the way he and his wife would open up their home to younger candidates who might have trouble raising money is something you very rarely see on the part of politicians.
No. And being in the State House, certainly as a Democrat, Olethe, you have kind of benefited a little bit from the Docking legacy. How has his legacy impacted your career?
Well, absolutely. Jill and Tom Docking have had events for me at their home. The thing that the other day at the service, which was just beautiful, was something that was shared, and I had to, think back on how he used to make me feel when he interacted with me. He could make you feel like you were the only person in the room. I just appreciate the fact, and I want people to know that he was one of those type of people that made you, that it wasn't like, he thought he was better than them. He was one of them. And he was a statesman who actually ran for office to make life better for all people.
As we look forward to a Kansas without Tom Docking, what do we see next? Does Jill run for office again? Is this kind of the end of the Dockings in Kansas politics?
I will jump right in. I will jump right in. I will say no, because I think perhaps Jill does run for office. Maybe I'm wrong about this, but I think she does. when you're in I will agree, when you're in a room with him, you always felt like you were the only person in the room, and it had that statesman-like feel to it. I always felt that way when I interviewed him and talked to him. But I do believe maybe Jill makes a run at office because I think, talking to her and interviewing her, it feels like she has that same kind of care about Kansas, like she really wants to make a difference and really wants to do something for Kansas, something bigger, something larger than herself. And I think that's my lasting impression there of both Jill and he. And what are your I wanted to get your thoughts on how that would move forward with her, whether or not she would run.
I can't predict it because she's run a number of races, and it's hard work. One thing I would want to bring out, though, we commonly don't hear about when he ran for governor against Mike Hayden. And I've been watching Kansas races since I came to Wichita in 1970. And I think that the race that he had against Mike Hayden was probably the most issue-oriented, with lack of vitriol in it, of any of the statewide races I've seen. I mean, it was a credit to him as well as Governor Hayden of the kind of race they ran.
And Pilar, if I could say, I'm pretty sure we haven't seen the last of Jill because at the service, his colleague who spoke, his brother, Bill Docking, who spoke, everybody said that even when they went to visit Tom before he passed, he didn't want to talk about his illness. He just wanted to he wanted to tell them what else they needed to do. Yeah. So I think there's more to come from the Docking family.
All right, we'll keep an eye on that. Talking politics, turning to politics in 2017, the race to determine who will be Kansas' next governor gets more and more crowded by the week. In the last couple of weeks, 2 more candidates have entered the race, both from Wichita, with House Minority Leader Jim Ward and former legislator Mark Hutton tossing their hats in the ring. With an unpopular governor about to leave office and the future direction of both parties in play, the crowd of candidates looking to lead Kansas continues to grow. Add Wichitans Jim Ward and Mark Hutton to the mix. Ward will give up his spot as House Minority Leader to join Carl Brewer, Josh Svati, and Arden Anderson in the first Democratic primary for governor in 20 years. And now businessman and former conservative lawmaker Mark Hutton is running on the Republican side. That field is even more crowded, with Lieutenant Governor Jeff Collier, Secretary of State Chris Kobach, Insurance Commissioner Ken Seltzer, Wichita businessman Wink Hartman, Ed O'Malley, and Jim Barnett all running. And certainly we've talked about this race almost every time new members join. How many more are there going to be?
Oh, well, that I don't know.
Does anybody?
But a sense of reality ought to set in. Nobody from Wichita has been elected as a governor or senator since in the mid-1930s. And I think there's a real bias against Kansas, against Wichita throughout Kansas. And so that's a real handicap for the two most prominent people who've held office. And Savardi, on the other hand, is a right-to-life person, and he's under a handicap in the Democratic primary because of that. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, okay, it's certainly going to be a long one. Looking at our 2 newest candidates, Jim Ward, we kind of all expected him to run. We had him on here a few weeks ago and we're trying to get him to comment. We knew he was going to do it, but yeah, he's been in the game a long time. He's kind of one of the old hands here in Kansas.
He has, but it's interesting to see how he has kind of positioned himself over time to try and gather a coalition. I will say this, Mark Hutton has a strong coalition that he's put together. Now, 2 years ago, there was a strong influence from the Hutton group, and that's not a term maybe I said on air perhaps, but we all knew that that was something that was happening behind the scenes. Mm-hmm. Hutton had a large influence with a lot of people, and they followed him. So the question is, does that translate into the voting booth? I don't know.
I tell you, of course, I do want a Democratic governor. I'll say that for the record. And all the Democratic candidates I've served with. And so I just really feel that all of them will bring something different to the table. I grew up with Carl Brewer. I have served closely with Representative Jim Ward. I served with Joshua Swati in the House of Representatives. And I feel the winner of this is going to be the person who touches the voter 3 times.
Okay. Very standard, very strong political impact. You got to touch the voter, got to get out there, press the flesh, knock on doors. And I think we're going to see a lot of that in the coming months. So certainly not the last time we'll talk about the governor's race, but we do have other things to talk about. Football season has a definite beginning each year, and that time is now as high school football is officially underway here in Kansas. It's an exciting time for fans and players, but concerns over the sport are growing as more evidence pours in showing the connection between football and brain injuries. Starting last season and continuing this year, the Kansas High School Activities Association limits the time teams can spend on contact drills, with no contact for the first 5 practices, no contact after game days, and on days when contact drills are allowed, coaches are restricted to an hour and a half per day. Previously, in 2012, the state legislature set specific protocols to prevent and deal with head injuries. And teachers receive training on how to recognize signs of a concussion or other head injury in the classroom. But is it all enough in this day when football players are bigger and stronger than ever? And certainly lots of changes in that. For those of you who are not aware in our audience, I am teaching at West High School this year, journalism. But one of the things that we had to go through as teachers for this school year was training on recognizing symptoms of concussion in student athletes in the classroom. So certainly school districts are taking this seriously. And yet it keeps going on. I mean, is there an end to this?
Let me, as a father with 2 boys who are now playing high school football, it's weird. Yes, I'm getting old. A freshman and a sophomore, and they're both young. My son, who was a freshman last year, did have a concussion, and he's okay with me saying that publicly. It's weird because a concussion can do a lot of things that you don't realize it's doing to you. Sleep deprivation, you're having trouble focusing, concentration, and just the general pain and general malaise that goes with it. It's a bad thing. But there was a large movement at the school where he is at from parents to try and say, hey, let's get a little more cognizant of what's happening here. Why are we getting so many concussions? Because at our little school, and it's a small one, they had, I think, 9 concussions last year. Now, for a smaller school, that's a lot.
Yeah.
Now, they bought new helmets this year, so they are a 5-star rated helmet. But still, the question comes up, do you want to put your boy back out there on the field, or girl, because, yes, there's a girl at our small school playing football, too. She's pretty good. Do you want to put your child back into that and try and go through that? Because concussion can lead to brain injuries. There's no doubt about that. We know that there are some long-term impacts here. So, yes, my boy's playing football this year. I'll be honest with you. Yes, it scares me. So teachers have become a little more aware of it. Not only the coaches, but the coaches are aware of it, and they're yanking kids out of the game if they think there's something going on, even if the kid's saying, hey, I want back out there, because let's face it, it's football. You want to get back out there. But teachers are becoming more aware of it, and I'm glad to see that as a parent.
Yeah. Well, and I know you talked about your son having a concussion. I was actually quite relieved when my son, and I'm going to top you on the age thing here, my senior...
Oh, you have a senior. Okay.
I have a senior.
Okay.
When my senior told me that he was not interested in playing high school football, I was like, yay, I don't have to worry about it. But lots of us have personal stories of relatives who have dealt with concussions. Certainly, Dr. Khan, you have had such an incident with your family.
Well, my grandson was a good high school player. I felt very good, as did his parents, that he wasn't good enough to make it in college.
Yeah.
Because even with the great improvement we've had in helmets, nevertheless, a lot of the injury comes from the brain floating inside the head, going back and forth, hitting the sides of the skull. And so the helmet by itself is far from giving, perfect protection.
Yeah, and we've had some changes in law here the last few years, but is there anything else that politicians can do?
Well, here's what, a lot of times we pass laws. And you said that you're teaching at school and you had to go through a course. So let me ask you, are we putting parents through that course? Perhaps you should have an assembly where parents come in and hear what you've heard so that they can help.
It's a good question. I know there's a concussion video that the kids are required to watch.
The kids have to watch the
Mom
video.
and dad are supposed to be there. But I don't think there's a general assembly. I can't speak for everywhere. But
so
that's
what
something
I'm saying.
I think that varies
we
district
can
to
pass
district.
laws, but the implementation of them, we don't get to follow them. So I'd like to ask, you to let us know, you know, if parents are watching that, because parents know best when they see their children, they see if they're, you know, just not right. And so we have to have everybody at the table to help look at this serious issue.
Well, and certainly that is the argument about having teachers cognizant of what changes to look for in student athletes, because to be honest, teachers oftentimes see their kids for more hours in a day than parents do, especially when you're talking at the high school level. Lord knows I don't see my son that often between school and activities, but it's the symptoms of a concussion.
Well, that's part of the
Can be so subtle.
And that's part of the problem that I saw last year with my son and the star running back that we had as well. My son's a big boy. He's a very large kid. But you know what? He wanted to keep going out there. And finally, Coach said, you know what? No, let's step aside. And it was one of the teachers that said the next day, hey, I think this is a lot worse than it appears to be. And I said, I agree with you. Let's get him into the doctor. And we got the scan. And sure enough, it was a pretty monster-sized concussion. It's important that teachers do a little more with this. And I talked to a lot of parents last year that said, I wish teachers would do more. You know, I know we can do some things on the state level to delegate authority back to the schools, but it would be nice to have parents get a little more involved with this.
Just common sense of having them take those breaks to drink water.
Yeah.
Sure.
Well, and obviously, as we've talked about, they have made some changes at the state level as far as requirements. How much of a political issue is this, or is this just a governmental issue?
Oh, I think more and more parents are concerned. On the other hand, to many, football is everything, particularly the state of Texas, Friday night football.
Yes.
And but you know, I would like to add one thing, that basketball is more and more coming into this problem, as it's a lot rougher than it used to be. You get many more injuries, and some of them are concussions.
Yeah, basketball, soccer, you know, all of these active sports. When I was a cheerleader in high school, we had to go through concussion training because you do the lifts, and there was a question of if they fall, what happens? So, I mean, I don't think there is a sport where you don't have concussion danger of some sort.
In soccer, I mean, these long kicks of the ball when they land on the head can have an
Even
impact.
volleyball, one of the parents that I talked to said, hey, my kid has a concussion from playing volleyball. Could you do some stories on it? So I know what happens in different sports.
Well, I guess the consensus that I'm getting here from this discussion is we need parents to speak up, speak to the teachers, speak to the school district, the school board, talk to your state lawmakers about what needs to happen.
Absolutely.
So, all right. Well, we're going to leave that there, and that is all we have for this evening. Thanks for being here, all three of you. I am so glad you're able to join us, and I hope to see you guys again. And thank you out there for joining us as well on this edition of Kansas Week. If you have a comment or question, send us an email at kansasweek@kpts.org. I'm Pilar Pedraza. Enjoy your weekend.